Most coaches say that it's important for athletes to train their core. But why? And what does that actually mean? I've been curious about this for a while, so I took a really deep dive on this, and I'm excited because today we're gonna dive into these specific biomechanics of why and how athletes should train their core to maximize performance and reduce risk of injury. First, we'll cover the biomechanics of running and discuss how the core functions to transmit forces through the body. Second, we'll discuss injury considerations and how core training can help athletes reduce overuse injuries. Third, we'll show you exercise examples so you know exactly how to implement this yourself or with your athletes. Let's go and dive into it, starting with biomechanics. So one main function of the core is to connect the upper body and the lower body, transmitting force efficiently through the kinetic chain. A weak or underactive core reduces power output and increases compensatory movements, leading to inefficiency and fatigue. For instance, in sprinting, weak core muscles can cause excessive lumbar extension and reduce stride efficiency. By contrast though, athletes with a strong core can essentially reduce energy leaks and maximize force production. Let's look at what specifically that looks like. First, I want to talk about training, and then we'll look at specific running mechanics and the relationship. So different athletes will take different approaches to this. Let's look at one example. Here you can see Karsten Warholm, who is an elite hurdle athlete, doing full range of motion hip flexion and extension. As a hurdle athlete, this should make sense because you need that hip flexor to be fast and strong. Not only to lift up into hip flexion to clear a hurdle, but he also needs the hip extensors to be strong to snap down into extension on landing. Now let's actually contrast this with another elite hurdle athlete, Sydney McLaughlin. So you can see a very similar exercise, but in this case, she's very focused on front side mechanics. And there are some specific things her coaches are doing here. If you look, her coach is cueing the core muscles to make this an anti-extension exercise at the trunk and emphasize just movement through the hip flexion, meaning that she's working her hip through hip flexion without using movement at the lower back. This is something that can be beneficial for all athletes to learn in practice because it's really common for athletes to move at the lower back and not really actually strengthen the hip flexors. Some other specific things that you'll notice with this drill is that the coach actually extended the foot platform of the machine so that way she can get a really strong stance on the opposite leg, and he's cueing at the inferior ribs and at the front of the hips to make this drill really effective. So now let's think about these drills in the relation to running mechanics. And we're going to specifically talk about the relation to what we call front side running mechanics, where the leg is in front of the body. And front side mechanics involve driving the knee forward in front of the body. To make this really clear, let's now look at an example of good versus bad front side mechanics. In the top video, you can see that the athlete's knee is driving forward and also that the ankle is stacked underneath the knee. These are really solid front side mechanics. By contrast, the lower video demonstrates poor front side mechanics. The knee doesn't get very high to start, and the ankle is way in front of the knee. This doesn't put the athlete in a good position on ground contact. You can see compensations all over. At the trunk, the compensation is leaning forward, so you see that bottom athlete really leaning the trunk forward. The athlete is also cutting the arm swing short on the back. And the most obvious thing is just the excessive backside mechanics. Just take a look at how much time the athlete on the bottom is spending with the leg behind the body versus the athlete on top. There are obviously a lot of different factors playing into this and the difference in mechanics. Hip flexor strength could be playing a role. Also though, capacity for storing elastic energy could be playing a role. It's also possible that the athlete at the bottom is just being pushed to the edge of his max speed, which may be, for example, 21 mile per hour, where the athlete on the top may be able to reach 22 or 22.5 mile per hour, so at the same speed, his mechanics stay solid. Either way though, it's a great visual for breakdown of mechanics. Furthermore, I really want you to look at the top video and get an idea of the shapes that an athlete needs to be able to assume. This will help you get a better lens and thought process going on with your strength and conditioning programming. And this is actually a perspective that I've gotten from a lot of great coaches, and most recently from Derek Hansen at a Sportsmith Strength and Conditioning conference. So I want to actually share an image that he recently shared on Instagram with you guys, because I think this is a truly incredible image. This really changed my whole perspective on speed training. Let's break it down. So this is actually originally from a speed coach, Charlie Francis, but Derek kind of actually broke the image down and it actually made it a lot more easy to understand. The image on the left is showing an athlete with a position more similar to the video on top that we just saw, with really good frontside mechanics. Here are some key differences between that image on the left and the image on the right. The left side is going to have a significantly higher hip height. Elite sprinters with great mechanics are going to maintain higher hip position with less vertical oscillation. By contrast, a weaker or slower sprinter, or honestly a distance runner, soccer player, or other athlete running, will tend to demonstrate more vertical oscillation. Said another way, they'll be in contact with the ground longer and they'll go through more joint excursion, sort of leaking energy. And I think it's important to note that there's a postural component to this with the approximately 4 to 7 times body weight forces that occur during running. If you place those really high vertical forces on a solid system, then that system can store and release energy quickly and it's elastic. But that's not the case with poor mechanics, such as that excessive backside mechanics position that we've been talking about. And this should make sense. If I just go to the side and I assume a tall, strong position, you could push on my head and I'm not really gonna collapse much. But if I'm in this extended position with more of an open rib position, more backside mechanics, and then I get pushed on, it's much easier to collapse me down. So when we're thinking about mechanics and the shapes that athletes need to get into, think about how heavy forces on different postures or different positions will affect the athlete. Elite sprinters maintain their top speed mechanics for longer and essentially slow down and leak energy the least, especially in the last 40 meters of, for example, a 100-meter race. But here's the thing, when you understand the fundamental aspects of human movement, you realize this applies broadly to athletes beyond just sprinters. And anecdotally at least, the fastest athletes across multiple sports, Xavier Worthy, Christian McCaffrey, Tyreek Hill in NFL football, or Erling Haaland in soccer, and other athletes tend to train track and field drills and or often have a track and field background with a really good coach. So mechanics really do matter here. All right, so now let's get back to how core training relates to all of this interesting running biomechanics. And if you've learned something already, I'd really appreciate if you could take a second to hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. I learned something today, because I really do appreciate whenever I see those, especially months or years later. All right, now for part 2, getting back to core training and injury considerations and how core training can help athletes reduce overuse injuries. Repetitive sport movements can often cause lower back discomfort or pain, and this is more common than a lot of people realize. For example, a relatively common back injury in athletes is something called spondylolisthesis. And this refers to a condition where one of the vertebrae in the spine, usually in the lower back, isn't really in the proper position due to repeated stress from athletic activities. This and other diagnoses can cause lower back pain, and the prevalence is surprisingly high, around 15 to 47% across multiple sports. And it's particularly prevalent in sports involving repeated hyperextension and rotation of the lumbar spine, like gymnastics, diving, football, and weightlifting. Now, these types of injuries are always multifactorial, meaning a lot of things play a role, such as training volume, the nature of the sport movement the athlete is doing, and things like physical preparation. Strengthening the anterior core is essentially one line of defense that we have against the stress of repeated extension. If we look back at the video of Sydney McLaughlin's training, we can get an idea of conceptually how this may work. Getting more motion from true hip flexion can help athletes rely less on extension-based mechanics. So this is essentially an anti-extension exercise to the trunk and loading hip flexion. And you can see the way she's doing a sit-up actually is also another example of an anti-extension exercise. And the importance of building that strong core goes beyond sprinting. There are other sport movements where having anterior core strength can reduce the tendency to collapse or to fatigue into extension. So now you're probably wondering, how do we actually train this beyond just a few drills that we showed so far? So let's move on to part 3, which is our exercise examples. And here there are 6 different categories of exercises that you can consider for core training. Let's start with the 2 that work the anterior core, which is what we've been talking about already. And the anterior core is really primarily made up of the rectus abdominis, with the psoas or the hip flexor muscle as well. The 2 categories of core exercises that train the anterior core are flexion and anti-extension. Flexion-based exercises would include things like reverse crunches, hanging leg raises, or something like a cable crunch. By contrast, anti-extension exercises targeting the same muscle group work the core isometrically. So examples here could be something like a weighted plank, a dead bug, or a stability ball stir the pot. Both flexion exercises And anti-extension exercises can be beneficial for the anterior core, just in a slightly different way. Anti-extension is going to be a little bit more focused on stability, whereas flexion is going to be more focused on actually creating that movement. The next category of exercises that we have is lateral flexion. Lateral flexion exercises tend to target the obliques as well as the quadratus lumborum in the lower back. Some examples of lateral flexion exercises include a side plank hip dip and also dumbbell side bend. And the same muscles that create side bending also would prevent side bending. So anti-lateral flexion exercises would also train the obliques and the quadratus lumborum. And exercise examples of anti-lateral flexion would be something like a side plank, a suitcase carry, or even a single arm deadlift. And then the next primary category of core exercises is rotation. Rotation exercises target the obliques. Some examples of rotation-based exercises include a med ball rotational throw, which can be done against a wall, a cable wood chop, high to low, or even a landmine rotational press. And then the last category is anti-rotation muscles, targeting again the same muscle group, the obliques. Some examples of anti-rotation exercises could be something like a single arm plank or a Pallof position overcoming isometric. I think this is an interesting one. Instead of having a band or light resistance, you can actually have a stiff strap and then push into it as hard as you can. And that actually has high transfer to bat speed, for example. So out of these 6 categories of core exercises, what should you actually train? Prioritize the ones that involve movement like flexion, lateral flexion, and rotation if you want to improve mobility, hypertrophy, and dynamic strength. Prioritize bracing strategies like anti-extension, anti-lateral flexion, and anti-rotation to improve stability, isometric strength, stiffness, force transfer, and also injury resiliency. And of course, a lot of exercises are going to do a little bit of both. Overall, we covered the biomechanics of running and discussed how the core functions to transmit force throughout the body. We talked about injury considerations and how core training can help athletes reduce overuse injuries. And we also showed you some different exercise examples and categories to be strategic with your core training. All together, now I hope that you'll be able to actually use this information to better analyze your own athlete's movement and assign specific movements that make a meaningful difference and carry over to high-level function. And if you guys do like the way that we teach things, you can learn more from us with our continuing education courses and also earn NSCA CEUs towards maintaining your CSCS certification at themovementsystem.com. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and I'll catch you in the next one.